I'm Bill Jeffway, the Executive Director of the Dutchess County Historical Society. Thanks for joining. Welcome everyone to this Black History Month presentation. I'm particularly happy to thank the Dutchess County Government, who has been a longtime sponsor of our Black History Month talk. And they are this February, and this is on top of the Rev 250 grants we've gotten from the Dutchess County Government have really helped us get the word out about the founding of our country, and tonight in particular about the contributions of Black residents. I also wanted to particularly thank Celebrating the African Spirit. I've been involved with that group for a long time, and thank you for their partnership and endorsement of tonight's program. I'll talk a little bit at the end of some of the amazing things they've done to help raise the profile of enslaved Africans and their descendants locally. So I've called this 1776 to 1876, the long journey of African Americans and the elusive promise of equality. I wanted to take America's first century because taking more than that would make this almost an impossible task. It was hard as it was. But it fits really in the context of what we're doing overall for the Revolutionary War programs. We are looking at Revolutionary Dutchess through the lens of its people, and there are some distinct aspects to the county that I would like to point out that are relevant to anyone that we're talking about here. We like to call Dutchess County the crossroads of the American Revolution because it was very much so geographically, right? The British wanted to split the colonies by controlling the Hudson River, and they controlled Canada and New York City. If they could have the whole river, they would have cut the colonies in half. And also we're between New England and the rest of the United States in terms of migration. So we had a lot of New England Quakers coming our way, and you'll see why that's particularly important to Black history. But we are looking at that diverse crossroads in terms of the journeys that different groups took toward the American promise of freedom. The words were all men are created equal. A lot of people who felt their gender or their faith or race should also be treated equally, heard themselves named in that. And so the entire program from the Dutchess County Historical Society is looking at the journeys of racial justice for Blacks and for Indigenous people, for women, for religious freedom, and for working class rights. And that will be part of the yearbook that will be coming out in a couple of months and launched at our membership meeting late April at FDR Library. So I just want to set up this idea. Why are we looking at the journeys of local Blacks in this century? Because we're looking at the journeys of a lot of different types of people or groups who wanted to advocate for themselves toward the promise of equality. We continue to use this as a benchmark. It was 1987. In the Dutchess County Historical Society yearbook, which was founded in 1914, so we're a long-serving historical journal, the professor at Vassar, Lawrence Mamiya, and the Black community leader, Lorraine Roberts, wrote an article calling for mentioning Invisible People, Untold Stories, a historical overview of the Black community in Poughkeepsie. And I think that's always been a kind of calling to us, or a kind of a benchmark. They laid down this proposition that there were many stories to be told, and I hope by the end, and we'll look at some in particular that are more recently told, we might feel that we're beginning to address what the professor and Ms. Roberts called for in 1987. So I lay that out just as a background. There are three particular chapters I want to go over. The first one is between 1776 and 1799, choosing sides and seeking the promise. And what immediately becomes visible is the dynamic you'll see all along is the parallel process of state and federal, progress or setbacks. And between 1776 and 1799, we have a series of either federal steps or state steps toward the promise of equality for blacks. And so that first section will take us through the Revolutionary War, how it came to be that 3 times as many blacks fought for the British than the American patriots. And then by 1799, when New York State formally grants the Gradual Abolition Act, actually establishing the first time that there's a promise, albeit delayed and gradual and down the road, but it is a promise of eventual freedom. The second section, 1799 to 1865, I look at because the process of New York becoming free, which happened in 1827 when slavery was abolished, was a kind of muted celebration by the Black community on July 4th and July 5th, 1827. We all know Abraham Lincoln warned the country in 1858 that a house divided could not stand. He said the United States will become all slave or all free, but it can't be either. It can't be part and parcel. And we'll see why the largest state in New York, largest slave state, New York, becoming free, actually begins to really accelerate this divided house that cannot stand. And then the third chapter is actually really quite brief. It's a little more of a sign-off because it's after the Civil War and it's a series of promises, and it's probably more the stepping stone to the next century. So the third chapter is quite brief. With all that's going on in the nation about what history should we celebrate and what if history makes someone uncomfortable or what, I always thought it's still maybe even more relevant than ever to talk about what history we do want to talk about, right? It's Black History Month. How do we figure out what we should be talking about if we want a more complete view of history? And that kind of is an easy answer, at least from my perspective. If we go back a century, the famous Lucy Maynard Salmon at Vassar College, I think provocatively wrote this under the heading, "Why is History Rewritten?" saying nothing's more serious than the need to constantly rewrite history, and it sounds very controversial. But she goes on to say, each new day enables a truer perspective, new information, new voices, new ways of studying. And her, ultimately, she's famously known for going to the source. And this really is the philosophy of the Historical Society and most historians, that we want to study a truthful history by looking at source material from the past. Even at the Historical Society, one of the awards we give out each year is the Helen Wilkinson Reynolds Award, and that honors historians who are exemplars in pursuit of the necessary and accurate historical truth, which is not always comfortable. Just to add a few more points about this, I've always been impressed, I think, of people who've really struggled or suffered, like Sojourner Truth, who was an enslaved woman, the kind of mental and physical scars. She was born Isabella Baumfree, but she renamed herself Sojourner Truth because she felt that was God's mission for her. So here we bump into the importance of truth again. And then I was particularly impressed to see, when looking at Frederick Douglass's 4-hour speech at College Hill in 1858, was shortly after Lincoln's House Divided speech. He concluded the 4 hours at College Hill by saying, "Truth, however oppressed, however delayed, can never fail. God and humanity, time and eternity, in silence and in thunder, and in all the vicissitudes of existence, will, in the end, see truth triumphant." And of course, he said it a lot better than I did. But all these indications that we should go to the source and we should seek the truth, and that should be the guide for what history we study. I like to point out, and it's particularly relevant to the Black community, that Dutchess County was a place in between, like I said before, the Atlantic Ocean to the south, the Mohawk River leading to the United States west to the north, and of course, this was an important route for the Underground Railroad. Turns out it was also an important route for the kidnapping of free blacks who were illegally sold into slavery. We'll talk about that. But there we are in the middle, and you instantly see why New York is shaped like a T-bone. It's the rivers that are shaping the state. If we go back as much as 13,000 years when indigenous people were settling in New York State, or 10,000, and certainly 3,000 and 5,000 years here, we noticed that there were, again, a kind of a crossroads here of cultures and civilizations. The Mohican were a vast civilization to the north, and this U-shaped Roloff-Jansen Kill that just touches Dutchess County was their southernmost reach in very broad terms. The Wappinger were living here, and they were part of the Lenape or Delaware, reaching south to New York City and the Delaware River. The Schaghticoke to the east, Schaghticoke refers to a mingling of waters. There were a number of groups that came together, settling along the border there, with the Munsee to the west, largely across the river. So this idea of crossroads, in part, is driven by the fact that we are at a crossroads of waterways between the ocean and the Mohawk River and among these tributaries. But the biggest distinction, I think, that makes Dutchess County particularly interesting for the Revolutionary War is that we had a combination of the wealthiest persons here, really starting in earnest in the early 18th century. So you might have, by the early 18th century, less than 24 wealthy white men owning virtually all of the county. But they came with enslaved blacks, of course, and we also had what I would call dispossessed whites, especially through what we call the Big Bang in 1710 up north, was part of Dutchess County at the time. That's where at Livingston Manor, they arranged, Queen Anne arranged for what ended up locally at least to be, around 1,200 impoverished German Palatines. They were Protestant German refugees, and in a county that had a population of between 400 and 500 people, for 1,200 impoverished people to arrive was a huge impact. And the business failed within a year, and they started to reach south and up to the Mohawk River. So there's instantly a big disparity of the wealthiest persons in the nation, and the working class white mechanics movement largely described themselves as dispossessed, landless slaves. And that was their kind of calling card for economic fairness. So I think this is what makes Dutchess County particularly interesting, because we have the arrival in 1728 of what becomes the largest Quaker population outside of Philadelphia. And these people are abolitionists. They believe in indigenous justice. They believe in, it's kind of hard to describe, I wouldn't say they were fanatically liberal on women's issues, but they sought equal roles for women in education, which of course was even radical at the time. And through the channel to the south came Quakers from Long Island, and from the east from New England, who had these very distinct views that would clash with the wealthy people who were settling and who were enslavers. After the Revolutionary War, there's some great work by Del Upton, which showed that the military encampment in Fishkill at the time, the supply depot, and the militarization of southern Dutchess did two things. One, it pushed some of the Quakers further north, like into Milan and Pine Plains, but at the same time, there was a push toward Poughkeepsie and a wish for some to integrate more into the regular business and society. So we all know that there was this big split in 1827, the Hicksite split, but there were also these factions within Quakers struggling to decide if they wanted to remain isolated by moving north to northernmost Dutchess County, if they wanted to be more integrated into society and business in Poughkeepsie. And even though they weaken as a faith, many men and women who are local Quakers emerge as national voices on the stage for abolition and for women's rights and for indigenous rights. So finally, chapter 1, choosing sides and seeking the promise. I want to start largely here by going over profiles of some individuals. 1790 is the best information we have. Of course, the revolution was 1776, so a little before that, but the numbers are good in 1790, and we know that there were around 2,400 persons of color at the turn of that century and around the time of the revolution. And over time, the percent who were enslaved became lower. So you find that persons of color along river towns were largely enslaved, but those inland, because of the Quaker effect, there was a larger majority who were free. And this goes to the dynamic of Quakers, although they were slave owners themselves. In 1767, did step forward to start saying this was not something that should be tolerated, and it became a process of manumission, although it was slower than some would like, but it was certainly the earliest among the voices. So this dynamic of wealthy and impoverished, of enslaved and free and abolitionists and pacifists creates a really interesting dynamic in our county for the revolution when it comes to the question of equality. In terms, I mentioned that 3 times as many blacks supported loyalists versus patriots, roughly, we think. And there's kind of an obvious reason why. Lord Dunmore, November 1775, so just before the Declaration of Independence, declared, although he declared it from a ship offshore where he was trying to remain safe, he declared that all indented servants, Negroes and others appertaining to rebels, so if you were an American patriot who owned a slave, and if that enslaved a man was willing to bear arms joining Her Majesty's troops, they would be free. So there was a clear promise, although limited in scope. You had to be enslaved by an American patriot, and then you would ultimately get your freedom. It was designed for Virginia, but a lot of people heard it as kind of the British calling card, which wasn't necessarily accurate, but might have been wishful thinking. And what's interesting is the American patriot response is, remember, they're not Americans yet, they haven't declared independence, but it's almost hard to believe this is the American patriot response in Virginia. Here we have Edmund Pendleton in December of that year saying, hey, you, His Majesty's good and faithful subjects, are having your property stolen. All Negro and other slaves conspiring to repel shall be put to death. And so this is done under a kind of righteousness that those for the American Patriot cause are saying, we will protect slave owners' property rights. There was never kind of a broad statement made, and some states like Rhode Island got more progressive and built black regiments and so on, but there was never kind of a big promise to blacks across the states as to the implication of their work. So as a result, you really have some interesting things going on, and you don't always have the enslaved person aligned with their owner, but in this case we do. This is an amazing story from the Committee to Detect Conspiracies. And basically what was happening in Rhinebeck was there were 2 enslaved men named Jack, one owned by an American patriot, one owned by a British loyalist. And the enslavers were trying to enlist actions of the enslaved persons against each other. And ultimately, this was about persuading an enslaved person to burn the barn, which is about the worst thing you could do after the summer harvest and all the animals are in it. Kind of the worst thing you could do is burn down the barn of someone. But this was being plotted, and we call him Patriot Jack. Instead of going along with it, Patriot Jack, the enslaved black man, went undercover, gathered information, and then testified to the Committee to Detect conspiracies. And the loyalist Jack and the loyalist enslaver were taken before the committee. They actually kind of got off lightly after promising that they would be loyal to the United States. But it's an example where the division, and some say that Dutchess County might have been as much as 2/3 loyalist, because remember, that was the standing order. The American Patriot Cause was the cause that was disrupting the natural order and the way things had been. So what this reminds us is that the conflict was right here within us, locally, between families and neighbors who were on completely different opposite sides of the argument. I find this particularly brave. This is mentioned by Michael Groth, who is an amazing researcher. I've tried to find the original newspaper ads. I haven't quite yet, but he confirms their accurateness. There was a woman named Rachel, and she was enslaved by the Husted family in Stanford. She managed to escape to New York City, and New York City was occupied by the British, right? The city's occupied by the British, Canada to the north. And she made a trip up to burn down her former enslaver's house. And this was in 1781. And that's kind of an extraordinary thing if you think about what it would take to clandestinely travel like that and carry off this burning. But this is what is claimed by the enslaver, Ebenezer Husted of Stanford, and he was seriously offering a reward for her tracking down. I do use, you can see imagined portraits, I call them, to try to make this a bit real, but of course we don't really know what these persons necessarily looked like. This is an amazing story, again involving escape to New York City. Francis Griffin was enslaved by Jacob Duryea, and they traveled to British-occupied New York City, where Griffin went to the British and said, "I want to be free, I will be on your side." And Duryea demanded his property back, but he was protected by the British. And when the British lost the war and famously evacuated to Canada, there's a so-called Book of Negroes that is the ship's logs of the British who were evacuating to Canada after the war was lost by them. And there we find Francis Griffin, 45-year-old stout fellow, who was, quote unquote, the property of John Duryea of Dutchess County. So there's another interesting dynamic that involves the going to New York City. I wanted to cover a few examples of those who served, and this ties into a lot of things we've been talking about in terms of Quakerism. Philip Field was living in the Oblong in the southeast. So that Oblong was a narrow strip in eastern Dutchess. Quakers particularly liked because it had been debatable whether it was New York or Connecticut, and anyone seeking isolation kind of felt that that Oblong was attractive in that way. Was from Flushing in Queens County, and in 1776, Samuel Field manumitted Philip Field, and we know this from published histories. But he was not manumitted right away, and this is where sometimes the delays involved by Quakers manumitting slaves, this is a good example. So Samuel Field manumits Philip Field, but not until the war would be over, he thought, by 1780. Philip enlists at West Point. He's in the 2nd New York Regiment with the promise of a land bounty. It was not unusual. He was famously at the Winter of Valley Forge and was hospitalized and died in 1778 from the effects of that. There are some good records and documentation of his service, but there are some extraordinary insights here, to move my little screen. This is a transcription of Samuel Field's manumission of his slave. And he says, the freedom shall happen in 1780, given unto my mulatto man, known and bred by me by the name of Philip. And this was signed in 1776. And historians I've spoken to kind of agree that with the description of him saying bred by me does suggest that it may suggest paternal connection here. Bred by me could suggest that he was the father, because he's particularly describing a mulatto man, which would have been a description of either an Indian or a mixed race person. And that is, if that is so, that's kind of an amazing distinction. We happen to have at the Historical Society some documents. They're later, they just show that the land that was granted after his death, after Philip Field's service, that he earned through service, was granted to his white enslavers. And then the documents we have at the Historical Society are just documents that show what the white family is trying to do with the land that was granted based on Philip's service. Prince George is an interesting fellow because that's a long service. A lot of the pension applications we read, which is where we get a lot of the information, don't come anywhere near to that length of service. So Prince George actually enlists in the 3rd Connecticut Regiment as a drummer. Drummers are paid a little bit more than privates, musicians are, because they're seen as out front and in danger and more specialized than a private. He ended up dying impoverished at Freemanville in Beekman. We've known that Freemanville has been a free Black community in Beekman for a long time, but through these records we gain an insight into just how impoverished it was. So he was not able to become a landowner, and he had very little personal items that he declared when he was applying for his pension to prove that he deserved his pension. But there's some amazing thing. This is he would have been very involved famously in this raid on Long Island, where coming out of Connecticut, this regiment landed on Long Island in the middle of the night and raided a lot of British stores, took a lot of British vessels and stores, and the leader of that group was recognized by Congress. So Philip Field would have, Prince George would have had a very interesting first couple of months. His pension application shows a discharge signed by George Washington, and on the right are items from a museum that happen to relate to him that show his pay and the interest that he's getting. So he starts off well, but somehow ends up later in life in Freemanville, and he declares in his pension application that his total personal estate, and he owns no property, is a pot, 4 chairs, a pair of is that cast iron knives, 3 knives, 4 spoons, 2 bottles, a jug. Anyway, you get the idea. So somehow he ended up being quite impoverished at the end and not able to own land, which means he wouldn't have been able to vote. Jacob Lyle's one of the more interesting ones I find because he has a very lengthy pension application. Sadly, in part because he wasn't granted that one, so he had to reapply a lot, but he served in New Jersey. He was a fifer, he was a guard to protect stores and ammunition, a renter of bullets, a forage master in charge of the food and the supplies, and an armed guard over a couple of years. And he ends up in Milan buying an acre of land for $50. At a time when the requirement to vote was $250. But his story is particularly interesting because it helps us understand a little bit about why Lorraine Roberts was talking about invisible histories. These blue and yellow signs that you are familiar with were ironically generated around 1925 to 1935 to recognize the 150th anniversary of the American Revolution. And unfortunately, you didn't have to supply much fact-based information or sources, so Lucy Salmon wouldn't have liked that. So the local people decided that instead of it being the black burial ground, what it was Jacob Lyle's homestead. He was the first buried there. Other blacks lived there and were buried there. Instead of recognizing that black burial ground in the veteran, it was described as an Indian burial ground, the burial place of Chief Crow. And it turns out Chief Crow, by any means we can evaluate, is a fictional character. The lot was known as Crow Lot because it was a black burial ground. And the closer truth is that Revolutionary War veteran Jacob Lyle, his wife Betsy, and other people of color are buried here. But I am happy to say the town of Milan has recognized Jacob Lyle on their Veterans Wall. Tone Waring is interesting because, again, at a brutal service, he appears to have left Long Island as the British were arriving and occupying. He enlisted on condition of his freedom. He was a sapper and a miner. Those are the guys that have the axes that try to take down or erect these parapets right at the front of battle. So whenever they're approaching someplace, they're the first in to take down the obstructions that have been put up. And he ends up, we find out, impoverished later for many years, working just making brooms and baskets, which is something we often find for these persons. This depicts the kind of work that he would have been responsible for. And his discharge papers, if you were signed by General Knox. So that's not George Washington, but that's not too bad. So some of these, like this gentleman's service, is really well documented. And there ends up being a lake. Of course, by 1812, we lose the mountainous region of Dutchess County south to Putnam County. That was in 1812, so be it. So by later in that century, we come to learn that where Tone and his wife Hedda lived came to be known as Tonetta Lake, and it was known as Tonetta Lake for some time, and it was known that it was named for them for that reason. It's still referred to as such. Andrew Fraser, one of my favorite characters. You probably heard me talk about him. We can't prove he was born enslaved, but if you look at all the census records around that time, any person of color was enslaved. So we can pretty much assure he was born enslaved at the manor of Morrisania, which is today the Bronx. And the Morris and Graham families intermarried every other generation, and they had a little bit of fun with the names. But his service earned him his freedom and also a pension. He was successful at getting a pension, and he was known as this ancestor. So we know an awful lot about him because of his very lengthy sworn testimony, not just by him, but by those he had to get in addition to himself. What I like about the story of Andrew Fraser is that he was involved in the Battle of White Plains as a waiter to Colonel Morris. He was also a wagoner. He talks about gathering items from Tories, from British loyalists, and taking them to the Amenia furnace to be melted down and repurposed for American patriot purposes. So he has an interesting story himself. He was called the ancestor because of, according to a local historian, Isaac Hunting, because he had so many descendants, and these are some of them, and they all have an amazing service. Talk about journeys. The headstone on the left of Andrew Fraser is at the Rhinebeck Cemetery. His remains were removed from his Milan farm around the turn of the last century to a family plot. But his descendants, like Jerome Fraser, served in the Civil War. Another Jerome served in World War I. At the bottom, we say James Fraser, that's at the Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery, served in World War II. But speaking of journeys, and it goes a little bit beyond America's first century, but worth mentioning, his great-great-granddaughter became an outspoken women's leader. She was a leader for the advocacy of what she called the capacity of both persons of color and women, untapped capacity. And she became an important speaker, and in 1895 became the first Black woman to teach New York City white students. There had always been segregated, and she sued the city, lost, but embarrassed the city such that they hired her. And then she became the founder and president of the Women's Auxiliary to the Harlem Hellfighters, and kind of became known to Theodore Roosevelt and respected by him. And she won a prize. She was voted best teacher in New York City in 1919 at the end of the war. Got a trip to tour the battlefields where all the men she'd been helping served in combat. And then a couple of years ago, we found out that at the family plot, she had no headstone. So if we want to think about Lorraine Roberts and Professor Mamiya's call to talk about erased histories or make these histories visible, one of the ways we do that is by creating physical monuments. And in this case, Susan Elizabeth Fraser now has a headstone at Rhinebeck Cemetery next to her famous ancestor. Chapter 2, 1799 to 1865, green checkmark, state promise emerges, right, with the 1799 with the 1799 gradual Emancipation Act. So the state promise emerges, but as I suggested before, that was not necessarily going to make things easier nationally. And I want to remind us of comments by Dr. A.J. Williams Myers. He was an extraordinary academic that passed away a few years ago. And he talked about the importance of Blacks kind of going up this ladder, and that they were in a state of being dispossessed, intentionally dispossessed, described legally as property, but that through especially the growth of free Black communities, which will be part of what we look at, they were able to own property and own businesses. And it's this ownership of property and ownership of businesses and integration into the economics of the county that really was the underlying goal for anyone who was trying to escape slavery or be successful in the community. So just bear in mind that little ladder, if you will. And the years that are kind of landmark years in this period, I mentioned the 1799 Act, which it's a little confusing. It's very complicated as to what happens when, but ultimately mentions July 4th, 1827, whose 200th anniversary, of course, will be next year. In 1817, it was clarified again by the state to be more straightforward that on July 4th, 1827, all persons, enslaved persons, would be free. And there are a few little asterisks that mean some people slip through the cracks, but it is a clearer statement. 1824 is important. As abolition is approaching in New York State, what happens? There is a state convention. Any voter, white or Black, had to own property to vote. That requirement was lifted for whites, but left in place for Blacks. And it was left in place for Blacks until the adoption of the 15th Amendment in 1870, after the Civil War. And this was one of the most explicit race-based voting requirements ever. So this happens just a couple of years before abolition. Abolition in the state happens in 1827. 1850, you have the Fugitive Slave Act, which pretty much requires anyone in the North who is even aware of someone trying to escape freedom to turn them in. They become obliged to turn that person in. And this really, again, accelerates the pain of the divided house. And then, of course, by 1860, we have the beginning of the Civil War. those are kind of the landmark dates. What were some of the implications of that? There are very few census this detailed, but if you let's grab 1835. So 8 years after abolition, and we look at the census of the village of Poughkeepsie on the right, and we find that there are 1,035 voters, and the number of persons of color who can vote is 1. So that property requirement, I think you can see, is doing what its authors intended. And I will point out, though, that it's pretty certain that that one person was Uriah Boston, and we think that was his house on the right, on the left on Water Street. He was a barber, but a very successful barber, and a good example of how the many black men in that field kind of turned the barber network into an abolitionist and Underground Railroad network. I was, when I started studying local Black history in particular 25 years ago, I was struck by how important it was to not have people think that slavery here was like the South with big plantations, because largely enslaved persons was much more intimate. They were living in the basement or the attic and in the house. But the more we studied it, really more in the 18th century, so before the American Revolution, you had these big plantations with slave quarters. And the more documented ones are they're at Red Hook at Altamont, Everson. In Hyde Park, there's a description of the Stoutenburgs as having a house used for enslaved persons, and then in Clove Valley, there's an Amy House that's described as having a separate slave quarters. So that was more the exception to the rule, but it definitely was. It was definitely happening. We're finding more and more evidence of that. This is what I referenced about, what I meant to reference about Everson. And the 1,100-acre Everson farm is obviously not along the river, but it's more like what we think it is, those great estates. And Everson is remembered because he owned a large number of slaves, some accounts as many as 40. And that was an indication of his wealth and so on. So I mention it because large groups of enslaved persons were not just along the river, although there were more of them there, but they were happening in rural parts as well. There are some real indications of real destitution and poverty, and an kind of powerful example of that is Hyde Park's New Guinea community. These tended to be instances where either slavery ended and there was no off-ramp, or there was a large influx of freedom seekers from the South after 1827. That's what happened in Hyde Park. Between 1810 and 1830, the free black population that was counted, and so I'm sure that's an undercount, grew by a factor of 5. And we know through historians' records at the time that there was a place, the community was called New Guinea, but there was a free black man, Peter Griffin, who had bought property in 1814 along Crum-Elbow Creek, and it was protected by a bit of a cliff. And that area became really overrun with freedom seekers right after 1827, who were escaping to a free state, but literally had nothing in terms of their own wealth. Boys Town is amazing in Poughkeepsie because we can track it across a couple of centuries. I think this had more to do with a number of enslaved persons not having an off-ramp. And Boys Town shows up on the 1834 map. And if you go to earlier maps, there's a Boyce gentleman who must have been the enslaver there. But in the 1930s, we all know about redlining. There was a little line drawn around one particular road, Glenwood Avenue, and it was shown in red, and it had this lower redlining because it was quote unquote an old Negro settlement before the area was built up, and it says the eastern blocks are changing for the better, and maybe the other will change for the better. But how interesting that the remnant of this former enslaved small group of people um, was evidenced into the 1930s. And we have a couple of reports of even young women, young white women, seeking protection and isolation among that community, which is interesting. I mentioned that broadly, most people are living under the same roof in the attic or the basement. And these are instances of what I call scattered. They're not, uh, they're kind of living among the broader communities, and not surprisingly, they're in Quaker areas. And I just want to mention a couple. One is the amazing story of these Brown brothers. In the 1840s, one goes off whaling, ends up living in Australia. The other stays here in Poughkeepsie, and they have 40 years of correspondence between each other, and the letters survive among family descendants. And recently, a family descendant from Australia was here looking into their history. So these were brothers who were living not necessarily in a free Black community, not necessarily isolated in a cabin away somewhere, but kind of among the community, who the local Poughkeepsie gentleman ended up being a successful businessman, stove maker. And the brother in Australia was also successful. But the people we know best, probably, who meet this criteria are Abram Bolin and Anne, his wife. After he grew up in Dover, in this safe area for free Blacks, he came to Poughkeepsie and became a successful grocer, married Anne, and raised a good number of children in this house that still stands. And in terms of journeys, now we'll really go beyond our 1 century, but it's worth it in this instance. This house is where their son Gaius Bolin was living when he and his wife had a child called Jane. We'll talk about in a moment. But both Abram Bolin and Gaius Bolin were janitors at the courthouse. That was part of their work. But they had other things on their mind, because Gaius became the first Black graduate of Williams College and the first Black lawyer locally. And Gaius's daughter, who was born in that house, became the first Black female judge in the United States. There she is being sworn in by Fiorello LaGuardia in 1929. And so they are an amazing journey, if you will, of 3 generations and what can happen. I mentioned a couple isolated people. There's a Peter Jackson in Milan who's described as living in a hut set partly in the side of a knoll. We hear a lot of rudimentary houses that are almost like lean-tos or kind of carved out of the side of a wall. In Pine Woods, in Hyde Park, Solomon Garnett lived in a rude stone house, half cellar in the side of a hill. Through a diary, we know about the Tompkins place, where an unnamed former enslaved person was living in kind of the most rudimentary of situations. So, but these are, I describe them as isolated because they're not really part of a bigger community necessarily. I mentioned the importance of free Black communities and A.J. Williams Myers, so I don't have to go over that in detail here. But he did point out that the free Black communities were multiracial, and often you had interracial couples, and that's probably something we don't talk about enough, in part because it's really hard to track. But Abram Bolin's wife was half indigenous, and we do run into that quite a bit. The free Black communities that we've been looking at and having a better understanding there's one in Sheffield, Massachusetts called New Guinea. That was a time when New York was a slave state, Massachusetts was free, and freedom seekers were escaping New York to go to Massachusetts. Oak Street and Rhinebeck, we've got a lot of new information. Hyde Park, New Guinea. Poughkeepsie had an AME Zion church. Africa Lane in Marlborough was settled by Haitian refugees from the late 18th century. We mentioned Freemanville before, and Baxtertown and Fishkill. Beacon had a black community with a Methodist Episcopal Ebenezer Church. So these are the communities that are really what Dr. Williams Myers had in mind when he talked about formal stepping stones to get integrated into the economy. And just some quick pictures of what property ownership by these people looked like at the far left. The original house, that green house on the left in Hyde Park, the original house with the little left box to the left. These often, the initial houses were no more than 17 square feet, 17 by 17. And also that big white house in the middle, that is Oak Street, Rhinebeck. And again, the original house, because we've been in the basement and looked at the stonework, the original house, and this was a woman who owned and built that house. The original house was the little square piece off to the left, and some other examples. So there are surviving examples, some from quite early, in the early 1800s, that help us understand what that looked like. Part of the ladder, if you will, of Dr. Myers was to get even more to the center of the village and start to own businesses. And at the left there is a house that still stands in Hyde Park, built by a former enslaved man. The red house in the middle is a house in Rhinebeck. His grandfather was enslaved. He became free, and we talked about the Bowman House. So it's great. These are like literal physical examples of houses. You have similar ones in Red Hook. Prince Street in Red Hook is named for Prince Ellsworth, who built that house in the 1830s. And Alexander Gilson was a famous botanist. Roads, like St. Paul, are named for local black families. So if we care to learn, we can address this issue of invisibility because there's evidence all around us. In Hyde Park, the post office, the famous post office built under FDR's direction, was once owned by the son of an enslaved man and where he had his barber shop. The Baxtertown free black community we've often talked about, turns out that there were black-owned businesses as well, including a boarding house along the river that starts to help us appreciate how blacks, not just white Quakers, but blacks would have helped support the Underground Railroad. This is amazing because in the 1873 tax book of Milan, we find that a black woman owns 108 acres. And there were quite a few black women that owned houses or property on their own. This is a great story of a local black family that ended up going to Michigan and being successful farmers in Michigan. And we know that from descendants we've spoken to today. I'm going to wrap up by just going through this idea of a house divided that cannot stand, because there are really two main points about the divided house and the pressure that was building up. And that is that Southerners were losing their property, quote unquote, as they escaped to freedom in the North. And through more and more research, we've found that free blacks in the North, in so-called free states, were at a lot more risk of being illegally kidnapped and sold into slavery in the South. So these were some of the tensions of the divided house. Southerners losing their quote-unquote property, free blacks not really being able to remain free in a free state. We're learning more about the Underground Railroad along the river route, like this gentleman Samuel Thompson, who was well known as helping blacks escape to Canada. The barber network that I mentioned before is an important way that the black community was supporting the Underground Railroad, and we had a number of really well-known barbers in Poughkeepsie. The navigation along the river, Paul Cuffey is a famous black whaling captain, and we know that he did business in Poughkeepsie, so his ship would have been coming in and out and going around the world. The scribbles are from the 1840 census that they were taking at the Exchange House along the river, and you can see that there are persons of color who are waiters and boatmen and so on. And even the 1840 census shows Abram Williams became a kind of famous black captain along the river. So you have blacks who are both circumnavigating the world, navigating the Hudson River, operating hotels and other transportation, and they would have been kind of central and obvious to the underground, the kind of black organized Underground Railroad. An example of a family involved, and it's interesting, they're from Maryland. Maryland was, the border where the escape to the north was happening, and there was a family in Oak Street, Rhinebeck. Three of the boys were killed when, famously the steamboats raced each other and they blew up quite a bit. So you have this amazing headstone of four persons in Rhinebeck who died in a steamboat accident, but their father, Dennis Savoy, was involved as a black boatman on the steamships. So when you really look, you see a lot of opportunities for the black-led Underground Railroad. There are a lot of examples of, in particular, at least here at Poughkeepsie, 30 girls chose to help a 12-year-old black boy hide and get through on his way to the Underground Railroad. I don't know how accurate that story is, but it was published in the Liberator, the black paper. And then we know of a slave girl was brought to Poughkeepsie by Mrs. Wharton of Texas, and she managed in 1847 to escape to her freedom. Good for her. Even by 1860, there were fugitive slaves arriving from the south, walking across the frozen Hudson River, and more instances of this kind of travel. One of the most amazing ones is Robert St. John. We know from local historians that he didn't use the New Guinea community in Hyde Park as a transit stop, but as a permanent destination. So no doubt he was on his way to Canada, having left Brazil. He wasn't thinking, well, I'll just spend the rest of my life in Hyde Park. But he did spend the rest of his life in Park, and his wife and children are buried in Rhinebeck. He seems to be buried in Rhinebeck, although the stone doesn't reflect that. Quackenbush was a successful farmer in Hyde Park's New Guinea community. So I mention these all as people who could have and were likely to have been involved in the Underground Railroad, persons of color. And then this flip of the risk of kidnapping. The first kidnapping we know of a free black into slavery was actually a Quaker named Nathan Birdsall Jr. in 1767. So just at the time Quakers are declaring that it's anathema to own enslaved persons, this thing happens, and he is removed from the Quakers, but it had to have been always present in the mind of persons of color that even a Quaker at that time kind of violated their trust in that way. But the majority of kidnappings come later. This is 1818, when there was a large group, a number of them from Poughkeepsie, who were being organized to be sent south. This was illegal, but happened a great deal. And they were stopped in New York Harbor. J.W. Pennington reports of a young man named Goman who was, in 1831, kidnapped by the promise that he'd get some oranges if he went on board a vessel. And then in 1832, there was a kidnapping of a young boy by Isaac Butler. He ran a carriage operation, horse and carriage operation. He went to the south with the young boy and came back, and the boy was not there. Isaac Butler said he ran away. Long story short, the message gets back that the boy is alive and trying to get back, and he does get back, and Isaac Butler is taken to court. So the more we focus on that, the more we find. I am going to skip over the 1858 celebration and just finish with the the last chapter, which is the shortest. So between 1865 to 1876, as we know, the federal promise emerges as the 13th, 14th, and 15th constitutional amendments after America's deadliest war, right? 2% of the American population dies, would be the equivalent of 7 million people today. So these fundamental promises are put in place, but so are the cracks already beginning to show. 1865, the end of slavery. 13th Amendment, 1868, promises citizenship and due process. 1870, the Equal Protection Voting Rights Act, the 15th. 1875 Civil Rights Act is passed, later gets killed by the US Supreme Court. But in March of 1876, there's a ruling that was involving some violence in the South that kind of gives a loophole for some extremists to have had taken violent action against a group of blacks. And without getting into a lot of detail, it was a sign of things to come. The November 1876 US presidential election ended up so close, a deal was cut, that by the next year would begin the end of Reconstruction in the South, right? The removal of federal troops. And so, right in the celebration of American Centennial, after these extraordinary, profound constitutional amendments and deadly war, we begin to see cracks in the promises and where loopholes might begin to form. There's a wonderful story about Saul Garnett, who escaped from Virginia and lived for the rest of his life in New Guinea and Hyde Park as an old man going to the celebration of the adoption of the 15th Amendment in Poughkeepsie. So a couple of years ago, I don't think people thought so much about the Constitution, and I used to encourage them to do so. I think now people are probably thinking a lot more about the Constitution. I don't have to remind them. In 1871, so in this period, New York State chartered a black college that would have been based in Poughkeepsie named Toussaint College after the Haitian Revolutionary, and that was led by none other than Abram Bolin. So he didn't get his college, but his son went to Williams, and his granddaughter went to Yale Law School, became a judge. So that is a journey. And then in 1873, state law requires equal treatment, and that is beginning to set us up for the next chapter. This was just some newspaper articles, courtesy of Jean-Marc Superville-Savac. He has done a lot of work researching the incorporation of this college in 1871 that would have been based in Poughkeepsie, so I encourage you to look that up. I've been wrapping up with just a couple of snapshots of how we've made things more visible. Celebrating the African Spirit's goal is to raise the profile of enslaved Africans and their descendants. And we've done a lot of work at College Hill. And one of the things we learned is that Frederick Douglass gave this amazing talk to 4,000 people. And we talked about the importance of the three generations of the Bolins. And the city has named the Bolin Oval in honor of the generations of the three Bolins at the top of College Hill, and Frederick Douglass Way, the road that goes past where he spoke. Robert McHugh is an amazing Arlington High School teacher who works with his students to bring about Pomeroy markers, and they will shortly be installing a marker at Gaius Bolin's house at the entrance of College Hill. So that's one of the ways to Ms. Roberts and Professor Mamiya's call to raise the profile of this invisible history. There's Frederick Douglass Day on the left. There have been 5 consecutive ones on the anniversary of his speech, and last summer Frederick Douglass's great-great-grandson came and gave free books to young children. That's him signing the books. That's turned into quite a wonderful event. Celebrating the African Spirit built a monument to the enslaved and their descendants at Warriors Park, and there on the left you see some of the persons involved in its design. And Kalima Karim, second from the right, the board member who kind of led that effort. And it tells a story of enslaved persons that's very historically accurate, And I'll just mention I was taking some people down to see the monument. That's the little walkway elevator. And the woman on the left said she had just learned that she was a descendant of enslaved persons, and it was very meaningful for her to go to the monument. And I thought, this is why it's important that these stories are told. Sometimes we raise the profile of people like poor Susan Elizabeth Frey, who probably never thought she'd have a Wikipedia entry, but she now does as part of what we do. We advised the town of Rhinebeck on a new street name, and they're going to call it Sally Gilson Way. She was the first, earliest landowner on Oak Street, Black woman. And so there I wrap up with some images of the Jackson family of Milan, the kind of people we were talking about who kind of over that century saw their parents and grandparents, saw their expectations and hopes kind of raised with steps forward and a step and a half back. But anyway, I hope that helps you understand a little bit of the journeys they went through. The things that I'll just mention that are available to you are our encore edition of Local Black History is it's on Amazon, but it's free online. We hope students will use it. And we developed with the county grant American Journeys inspired by Lafayette. It looks at a local free Black couple naming their son Lafayette Williams after Lafayette's 1824 visit. Lafayette Williams went on to give his life in the Civil War. Anyway, there is great work done by Henry Frischknecht of Rhinebeck's 7th grade public school. Those are some paintings from Henry Frischknecht's class after they studied some of the local Black histories. And so that just leaves me to thank Celebrating the African Spirit and the Dutchess County in particular for all their very practical support in allowing this to come to life. And then I'll be happy to take questions.